This is just a quick 101 on how to color grade in DaVinci Resolve. You're free to use another video editor, but some things may vary depending on what editor you choose. So for the case of today, I am just going to use DaVinci Resolve, but feel free to adapt this to your needs. So first I want to start off by giving a quick overview of what we're going to do. And so we're going to start by looking at different types of scenes and how we're going to approach each different type of scene. So I want to preface this by saying that the job of a colorist is not to make the shot look good, in the sense that the shot out of camera should already be good. It's kind of like putting seasoning in a soup or something, or doing that final polish. The shot should already be good, and if you're having to color grade to make the shot good and to fix so much, then it's likely the shot isn't good. So the aim would be to have the shot be great right out of camera. Now, we don't always have that as the case, and so I'll give you some examples of some poorly done shots and some shots that might need a little bit of help, and how we adapt to doing that. So first things I want to say before I start, if you are using a Mac, this also applies if you're using a PC, you're going to want to turn off night shift or reader mode or whatever it's called in your operating system. And if I turn it on, you can see that it has this really ugly amber tint. And while this is great for reading at night, this is going to totally mess with your eye's perception of color. So you're going to want to turn that off so that you have the most accurate color possible. Another thing to note is that you're going to want to have your display on cinema mode or sort of a faithful mode, which would be what it would be called in color reproduction. And this would get it closer to what's called delta E, which is how we calibrate monitors, well, how they calibrate it in the factory. And you can do a quick Google search, but basically the lower this number or the closer this number is to 0, the more color accurate your display is. For color grading specifically, you want your monitor to be accurate. So whatever you need to do, find the mode for your monitor that makes it the most color accurate, and definitely do some research. If you're using a Mac or an Apple device, these have really good reputation for being color accurate. Without further ado, I'm just going to dive right into color grading. I don't want to bore you with a whole bunch of technical talk, but press Shift and then 9 on your keyboard, and that's going to bring up your project settings. And so you're going to want to check these two areas. So you're going to want to make sure your color space is set to Rec 2020. Now, it's okay if you have Rec 709. I would still recommend to do Rec 2020. Typically, you want to synchronize this with whatever color space you have on your camera. But in this case, because Rec 2020 is a more modern standard, you usually try to avoid Rec 709 unless you're looking for that retro look, sort of maybe the 80s or something. But generally, it's a look that we no longer use anymore in the modern era. So unless you're going for that retro look, just do 2020. And, it's a plus if your camera supports 2020, as that'll be the perfect synchronization of the color space. And if not, well, you're going to have to do a little bit more eyeballing, and that's okay. But yeah, color science, just leave this as the default. There is an option for color manage, but this is a more dynamic system. It's not a color space, and it's far more accurate, but it's mainly used for Hollywood studios. It's likely just gonna make whatever editing rig or laptop you have just panic. So I would highly suggest not doing this, as it's gonna cause significant lag. And this color space is good enough for 90% of scenarios, including the films that I have made. So then output color space is the same, so you can just click same as timeline, We also have this option, but we don't really need to click it. And to be honest, unless you absolutely want to have a separate color space and gamma, which is really confusing, I just would highly not suggest doing that unless you did that in camera. Okay, so after setting those two things, you don't really have to do anything here, and you can just hit save. And now if we go into the color tab, so it's the one with the little circles here, you're gonna see several things. So this is a very strange view right off the bat, and it might not be familiar to most people, but I'll just break it down. So you have your 4 primary wheels, and we're going to use this one. And if you have log, you can use the log wheels. I would not suggest using the color bars because this is not how film is edited. And you also have your curves, but again, that's more of a photography thing. You can use them, but the primary way that we'll be grading is through these wheels. There's also HDR, and this allows for a much finer level of control, but again, it's a little bit overkill if what you're doing is just some basic grading. So with that in mind, just basically use whichever wheels applies to what you shot your footage in. Okay, so let's start with lift. What is lift? Lift is going to be your shadows. And so if you've done photography, you're probably familiar with this term. It's basically what you expect, the dark parts of the image, and then you have your gamma. And the gamma is going to be your midtones, so everything in the center. So, you know, it's not quite highlights, it's not quite shadows. And then on here, on your third rail, you have the gain, and that is, as expected, it's your highlights, or the bright parts, say the sky, or maybe a bright light in an indoor setting. So that's where you're going to control all of that. And then you have your offset, and this is kind of the idea of the offset is more if these 3 primaries don't work and you want to offset it just a little bit, then you're going to use the offset wheel. So I very rarely use the offset wheel. And then the other 2 things you might play with that we'll play with are temperature, which is basically white balance, as well as tint. So these are basically the same things you have in camera. And it helps you to correct it after the fact. Let's say if you set it and the room was too green or it was too warm and you just don't like that look, you can go and kind of correct that. And so here we're going to start by looking at these scenes. So let's start with this really bright morning scene. This is super simple, nothing too complicated. So you can reset your viewer at any time pressing Z. So let's say you zoomed in like this, you can press Z, it'll just reset right back. So in our case, we're just going to zoom in just a little bit and just pan down just a slight bit. There we go. Okay, so let's get started by adding a bit of contrast. Now this was shot in HDR. If your footage is shot in standard definition, it might already have lots of contrast applied, and you probably don't want to add additional contrast. So in our case, we're watching very carefully. So you see these scopes here? Try not to rely on what you see all the time. This is a good reference, but again, as mentioned, if you don't have a color calibrated monitor, this is not going to be accurate to what you're actually looking at, and it's going to show up differently on other devices. And so basically what you're looking here is you don't want to clip the highlights. So anytime you see this go outside here, it's clip the highlights. Anything down here that you've seen go outside of here, that's clip the shadows. So you want to avoid clipping at all costs. And so in our case, that's a bit too much contrast, and you can kind of see it more in the dark and light areas. So if I zoom in a little bit, you can see how it's affecting it. I usually go to about 1.4-ish. And that for me is typically sufficient contrast. You can go further, but it just becomes way too extreme, and I highly don't recommend that. So at the maximum, 1.4 is a good ballpark. So over here, you're going to have your color space. And as shown in here, whichever color space you selected in your project settings will show up in this dark gray triangle. So the outer triangle with a little bit of a curve at the top, the light gray one, is the range of the human eye. Now we can't see every single color that is shown in, appears in real life. And so we're going to focus mainly on what shows up here. Now, if you notice, the reason why we do Rec 2020 is because if I do Rec 709 and I click Save, it reduces my colors by 50%. Now, this might not seem like a lot because you can see the colors in here don't really expand outside of that. But let's say I wanted to grade outside of here, I can't because it's going to clip and it's not going to show up properly and it's going to look oversaturated. And now we're going to do indoor scenes. So far we've just been color grading just the raw footage and we're not really using a color space. So when you do this, DaVinci is just guessing and most video editors will just guess. So that's typically not a good thing. So what we want to do is we want to go into our LUTs. So you're going to find this somewhere in your video editor. In this case in DaVinci, it's this one, this little second tab. So you're going to go under Film Looks. And depending on what your color space is, you're going to base us off of this. So if you shot in Rec 709, you would choose this LUT if you're looking for that retro look. And if you're shot in Rec 2020, you're going to do DCI P3. This is slightly confusing because you would think, why isn't it called Rec 2020? Because this color space is the color space that is commonly used for color accurate displays, such as, for example, in MacBooks or Apple devices, they use a DCI P3 standard. Or if you have a very color accurate monitor, it's going to have a really good Delta E score, and that's going to be DCI P3. So if you're looking for color grading, you want to look for a monitor that has DCI P3. And so in our case, you're going to notice that it looks like it has way too much contrast, and this is not the look we want. So when you're applying a LUT, so you're going to press Option or Alt and S. So in your nodes, you're going to press Option S, and that's going to add another node. So once you've added that node, you're going to go into Effects. So you're going to go and see Color Space Transform. Drag that onto the first node, okay? Then you're going to go out of here and back into the settings. Hang on, let me get my nodes back. There we go. Okay, so yeah, it's an output gamma, excuse me. There we go, Scene Film Log. So you can get a good look at that. So the only thing you're going to change is that. You're going to notice it gives this really flat look and it looks almost like a film look. And the reason is because most of these LUTs that are in here are not designed for raw footage, or they're not designed for consumer level footage. They are designed for cinema cameras. So you're going to need a cinema gamma to use them. So in our case, there's different numbers, and this just means how warm this is. It's very, very slight, and honestly, it's not going to be detrimental. But I like to choose the middle, so there's D65, D55, D60, and I usually like to go for D60 because it's the balance in between. So what you're going to do is you're going to click that, and now you're going to drag it to the second node. And there we go, and that would be your LUT base. And so this is where it just gets really confusing. And you notice you have a much wider color space now. So if I do the bypass again, I'm going to full screen it while I do this. So I'm pressing Shift and then D. You'll notice there's the original and there's the LUT. And you notice now it's gotten into that more film look. And in the film industry, this would mean that your footage is all in the right color space. And now you can begin color grading. So this is typically how you would do it in the professional sense. You don't have to use a LUT, but it is more accurate. Okay, so now we're going to take the contrast here. We're going to pull it up to 4, and you notice now this is going to work. In our case, since it's indoors, you could also pull it up to 1.3, and that might not be so harsh on the darker parts of the image, as you can see there. And now you'll definitely see, wow, this is really clipped, and you can even see it in your scope. Also, a side note, if any time if this scope doesn't work, click these 3 little toggles, click Reset View, and that'll fix it. It does sometimes glitch out. And so here, now we've got a very, very good contrasty image. It's proper in tone and exposure. well, maybe not the highlights. So that's what we're going to do in fix. So typically you take the highlights if it's very extreme like this, where it's absolutely just totally clipped. That's when you know you kind of need to rescue those highlights. So you're going to pull that down. You want to be careful how much you pull it down. I'm going to pull it down. In our case, actually, it's all the way because this was very bright from the LUT. Now you'll notice, okay, this is properly exposed, and you could actually use this shot now. So you can see the difference. Shift D, here's the original, and Shift D, now the color grade. Now you notice that's not very different, and so we're going to go and fix this. So in the SkyTrain, it's very warm, but the outside is very cold. We're going to maybe tone back the warmth because it's a little bit too warm, and you want some contrast between this yellow and the SkyTrain sort of beige. You don't want it sort of like this where it's all kind of soaked in sort of this kind of ugly amber tint. So we're just going to pull that back, and now you see the yellow stands out here from the actual beige of the SkyTrain. And there's a bit of a magenta tint, and depending on what you're looking for, that would be too far, but you pull it back a little bit to green, it's slightly more accurate in the sense that this is what the SkyTrain actually looks like, because in the original, if I reset this, it's a bit magenta-y, or magenta-ish. So you pull it a little bit, there you go. And now you have a very color accurate scene. So press Shift D and change that. It's very, very slight, and this is a color correction. This is not a color grade. So now you've corrected it. And so you can now see the scene looks much nicer. Okay, so it looks like we haven't really done much, and this is kind of where you get creative. And let's say we wanted to do the film look. I'll just do this for fun. So typically the film look is sort of teal and orange, so you pull this very, very carefully. And I want to really, really stress this. Do not go all the way like this. This is really ugly. If you need to go any further than like a couple like points here, then you're doing it wrong and there's something wrong with your footage. You should not have to pull it all the way here. It just looks really bad. So you pull this, look at the image, and watch the scopes here and watch here. So watch for the color around where it would be. So in this case, we're pulling it towards sort of green and blue almost. You're gonna watch for that and watch the footage. So I'm just gonna pull that a little bit, and you notice how it now has this little tint here, but it's a nice tint. And the thing about color grading is you want to make it look like it's baked into the footage. You do not want it to look like an Instagram filter. If you go like this is an Instagram filter. It's too harsh. So you don't want to do that. So you're going to take this and you're going to pull it very slightly, and you get that. And then with the gain for that orange teal look, you want the highlights to be orange. So we're going to go for orange and pull that ever so slightly. And in this case, it's already quite warm, so you can kind of see the difference there. Press Shift and D. You can see before and after. Okay, so now we have a pretty satisfying grade. Now, the good news is you only really have to do this once for most scenes, and you're not going to be doing this every scene because that's really tedious unless you're like a Hollywood studio. So copy, again, like we talked about, Command C and then Command V. Now we're going to do it for this scene. And you can see here how this affected this. Now this is a pretty good grade. And if you're going for that dark cinematic look, then this would actually be proper. Most of the time with shadows, you do try to make them look blue or teal, just due to the fact that in real life they do look just basically dark, but it's kind of boring. And so you kind of want to add a little bit of pizzazz, I guess, or a little bit of an interesting point to look at. So I'm going to reset the highlights here, and you can see how you could have different tones, but this looks more like an Instagram filter. And so I'm going to instead pull it down maybe halfway, because in this scene I want to preserve some of the outdoor highlights. And for the shadows, you can bring them up, but that's not really the best idea, so we'll just leave it there. But that's a fairly good grade, so you can see the before and the after. Okay, let's move on to a golden hour scene. So for here, now we're going to pull in our contrast all the way to 4. Very nice. You can already see how in golden hour it makes such a big difference. Now this is golden hour, so we want it to be warm. So we're going to pull that warmth, and we're going to pull some of the magenta tint. As you can see, get that really nice golden look. Because you don't want it to look really flat and plain. You want to really bring that out. And you notice the highlights now in the sweater, and maybe some of the hair you can see here is not properly exposed. So we're going to take those highlights, and we're going to pull them down slightly. And now you can see the details in the sweater better. Whereas before, it's really bright and it's kind of hard to see them. Basically following the scope. So try to aim around the middle for most of the tones. And then could you lift the shadows? You can. This is a preference-based thing, but if you want that high contrast golden hour look, you can just go for that. And you can see that the before and after, this is just a really, really good grade. And there's not really much that needs to be done. So if you want to go further, do the creative look of orange and teal, go there, maybe pull that down a little bit more, and now you can see that really emphasized right there. There we go. So again, very subtle. And again, you don't have to do the teal, shadows, but I very much prefer them because it just gives some more dynamicness to the shot, to have some teal or sort of blue shadows. It just looks nicer. That's a preference thing. And then copy and paste. You could do this for this, and you notice how for this it doesn't work because this is an outdoor scene, so we're gonna have to start from scratch again. But what we can do to save some time is paste, and then we can reset this by going to highlights, doing 0, go back to shadows here, again type 0, reset, and then now we have the gamma and the color space from here. We're gonna go in here and we're gonna pull up these shadows, and there we go, because they're a little bit too dark. It depends what you're looking for. There is contrast in golden hour, so we don't want to take all that contrast away depending on what your look is, but we definitely want to dial the highlights down. In this case, there's not much we can do to save the sky. We do try our best, like if I can pull it down. Okay, yeah, you can save the sky a little bit. So depending on if your camera has HDR, if it does, you're more likely to be able to recover the sky highlights if you shoot in HDR. If not, it's likely just going to look overblown. But in our case, you can see the before and the after, and this already looks a heck of a lot better, because if I turn this off, it's kind of like, okay, this is an okay shot. If I turn it on, it's got that nice, beautiful golden hour look. So now you notice that I've pulled the shadows too high, and I can exaggerate this a little bit more. If I pull it too high, you'll notice how there's no contrast whatsoever. This is what you want to avoid. This will look very cheap and sort of like amateur. You don't want to go for that. With film, you're always trying to create contrast. That's part of the film look. So we're going to pull the shadows down a little bit more, or we can reset them to 0. Now we have that nice golden hour look, and it's kind of okay because that's the scene. That's what it looks like. And so if it looks like that in real life, you don't want to go and like totally change the look, because typically what's shot in camera should be what stays in the final edit. So you don't want to deviate too much from that. If you don't like the look of it already right out of camera, then you might need to go back and reshoot it. So now let's just apply this LUT. We can apply it to here. You notice already it's done a lot of the heavy lifting, but you notice here, well, it looks fine. You don't want to destroy all these highlights. So since the other scene had too much highlights and we wanted to tone them down to save the sky, we toned them down. But for this grade, because now we're in the same location, but we're facing a different angle, we're going to go and reset that back to 0, just so that you can see the sign here has better contrast with the dark of the background. And again, it's very, very subtle. It's not meant to be like, wow, this is super different. It's just meant to correct those colors and add a bit of a tone. So just gonna mess around with this a bit more. You can see it's a lot about creativity at the end of the day, and it's a lot about getting that creative look. And so for me, I love that orange and teal look So I go for that, and you can see how that looks like film. If I full screen this, that looks like a shot from a film. And this just looks like this is a pretty standard shot. Let's take this grade again, because it's very similar, and let's go to another angle. I'm going to paste that grade, and notice how, okay, it looks pretty good, right? And this shot doesn't look too bad. Now, I've toned down the shadows in the other shot, so you want to reset this again. And a lot of this is doing this copying, pasting, and making small tweaks. You're not making massive changes, and it's very casual. You don't want to, if you see this more as work, it's gonna be grueling. If you see it as creativity, it's gonna be fun. And so try to look at it from that fun angle. You're making this very fun and interesting. And so like for this scene, you know, like this is just your very standard shot. It could have been shot on an iPhone. This was shot on a professional camera. And so you go here, full screen, and then there's your camera shot. And if I turn on the grade and I lift the shadows a little bit more, okay, actually in this scene it's night, so it's kind of okay. You notice it has more of that film feel just overall. And so I'm going to go through that, and now that we've developed this grade, we can basically paste it on most things and it works. Thing about night though to note is that you're not looking for that super high contrast look at night all the time. Sometimes if the shadows are too dark, like if I zoom in here, just one second. If I zoom in here, you notice how the original shot, it is very dark, but because you want to give it sort of that grayish tone and not clipped out shadows, you kind of brighten it just a bit so it's never pure black. Now you don't want to go crazy and go like this and go, oh, okay, I want to really, really bright, because while that might look good as an Instagram filter, that's not really the goal. So, okay, and finally we'll look at a really bad shot for night, and then we'll just, yeah. So this is a shot that looks good, but if you try and color grade this, you notice how off the bat, if the scopes in the shot are like this, you've done it wrong. If they're already clipping, you've done the exposure meter wrong on camera. Most shots have a lot of dynamic range, and you should see it spread across in this middle area. So if you're following the exposure guides on your camera, you're never really going to run into these scenarios where it's totally clipped. In this case, it's so clipped you can see it's all the way down at 0. And so your first thought might be, okay, well, I'll bring up the shadows. And you'll notice here the problem. When you bring up the shadows, it looks as grainy. It's the same thing as ISO. When you're video editing, and especially color grading, you are bringing up digitally after the fact, and that is never going to look good. You want to make sure you nail the exposure in camera, because you will run into issues like this that you cannot fix at all. And unless you have a very expensive raw camera, and even in those cases you try to avoid that, it's really hard to fix after the fact. And you could apply some contrast here and make it look somewhat acceptable, but you notice if you zoom in here that it's very noisy and grainy, and it's just not a very good shot, and it looks like you shot it off of a very cheap phone. So as a final note, color grading is to enhance the footage that is already good and not to create good footage right off the bat. Okay, well, I hope you found this helpful, and yeah, that's how to color grade in DaVinci Resolve 101. Hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, take care.